going to do essentially is walk through the downtown and use different sites to trigger different parts of the story of what happened in 1692. And when I first started doing this back in 1983, I knew nothing about what a witch was or what witchcraft was. So I went to the encyclopedia and I opened it, and I still have the Xerox copy at home. And right off the bat, by about line 3 in the definition, they talk about an individual, a human, making a pact with Satan, essentially selling his soul to Satan, and in turn he would go out and help Satan do his evil, which at that time could have meant anything from creating a famine to starting a war to killing somebody who was innocent, ruining crops, etc. There were no limits to what Satan could do, and he needed human agents or witches to do it. So the definition went on, and they talked about a human would sign the book, sometimes in blood, and thereby become a witch or a servant of Satan. And Satan would promise you supernatural gifts or powers. The gifts generally, supposedly, he reneged upon, and being Satan, you would expect no less from him. So I took this definition of witchcraft to Laurie Cabot, who was my neighbor, and I said to her, Laurie's a very well-known Wiccan, and I said, Laurie, I just looked up witchcraft in the encyclopedia and looked what it said, and she said, we're used to that, and it has nothing to do with the Wiccan religion, or the witches of today. And I said, well, how did you get from what it was to this definition? And she said, Malleus Maleficarum. And I said, what was that? And she said, look it up. So I did. I went and looked up Malleus Maleficarum, and it was a book published in the late 1480s, and it was written by 2 German Dominican monks. Their names were Kramer and Sprenger, and one of them was eventually drummed out of the church, for being such a criminal mind. And this book suddenly, almost out of nowhere, redefined what a witch was. And witches up to this point were essentially pagans, and they had gotten along very well with the Catholics, and Christians for about 1,200 years. And suddenly there was this gradual shift in philosophy and came to fruition in this book. Malleus Maleficarum defines witch as somebody who signs the devil's book and makes the pact and sells his soul like we just described. And then a witch will now help Satan do his thing, as we've also just described. And witchcraft now becomes, instead of just like a pagan religion, it now becomes a mortal sin and a crime punishable by death. And then the book also sets up rules for trial, talks about the types of evidence to use, etc. And then they take this book in completed form to the Pope. He examines it and he says, nice job, and it becomes the teaching of the church. And the Pope issues a papal bull with the book, calling on all of Christendom to rise up and crush out for once and for all these evil forces, the witches. Right? So suddenly the doors are open for governments or religions or individuals who want to get rid of their enemies to do so simply by accusing them of witchcraft and making the accusation stick if you can, and then they get put to death. And this was very effective. In the 200 years following the publication of this book and leading up to the witch trials in Salem, they said somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million people died in Europe as witches. Of course, 99% of them at least probably innocent people. And it becomes the great weapon for getting rid of heretics or enemies to your government or just individuals who you happen to have some issues with. Right? So, and the reason they were able to get away with that is because back then, before the age of science and reason came along, everybody was very superstitious, and they believed, in fact, that witches, and Satan would be involved and were responsible for anything that bad that went on in the earth. So, when the Puritans come over here and settle here, they bring that belief with them, and they decide they've got a chance for a fresh start, and they have a chance for a fresh start to keep witchcraft out of their society. And they build their entire society and their everyday life around the church. And it's very effective because when you hang on to God, there's no way that Satan can infiltrate your life, and as a result, he won't be using human agents or witches. And this strategy works. The church is a central thing in their life, and for the first 50 years of the colony, there's only about 15 executions for witchcraft. Compared to Europe, when they're losing tens of thousands of people a year, it's pretty impressive, And also during that time, there's this period of great prosperity, and that was a sign that God was very, very happy with the way they were living. Suddenly, in the 1680s, 40-some years after the colony starts developing, their world falls apart. Smallpox comes through, destroys millions of families, or thousands of families. The King of England revokes the charter, giving Massachusetts the right to exist, so they no longer have the right to self-government. The land grants are canceled. Then, a few years later, the French and Indian Wars break out and go very, very badly to the locals. So these 3 crises come along, and they last for a long time. You know, the war, the smallpox just keep going on and on. The charter is not replaced, and people view this as a sign that God is very unhappy with them for whatever reason. And if God is unhappy with you, they believe back then, he would allow Satan to run free until he felt that you had been punished enough. And if Satan were allowed to run free, he would need to be recruiting witches. So by the time 1692 rolls around, a lot of people in the colonies are saying, where are the witches? Satan has been running amok for half a decade. Where are his human agents? You know, we know that he uses them. Where are they? And I may be becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we're going to go up to the next stop, and we're going to talk about a situation, a little bit more background that's developing in a nearby community that will set the stage for the outbreak of the witchcraft hysteria in 19. They would take an egg white and put it in a glass, and that was a homemade crystal ball. And they would look into it and, you know, try to determine what their husband was going to do, when they were going to get married, etc., you know. And eventually, young Betty one day, and who knows how long this has been going on, a few months, she looked into this homemade crystal ball, and she saw the specter or apparition of a coffin. And she was terrified. And normally an 8-year-old who's terrified will run to the parents and tell them, you know, what happened, and, you know, try to get them some help. But she can't, because what she's been doing is illegal, and she doesn't want to get in trouble. So she hides it, and she holds it in. But as you know, you can only stuff emotions for so long, you know, fear and guilt and all these other things. And bit by bit, her behavior starts getting pretty bizarre, you know, over the period of a week or two. She gradually, her appetite diminishes, she has trouble concentrating, her parents speak to her and she's not really there, you know, she's out there somewhere, and she has trouble praying, and she's really very different. And the parents are very worried about her. What's the matter, honey, what's the matter? And she doesn't tell them because she'll get in trouble. The wall that surrounds the site, and if you looked at the other end, interrupting the wall is a wrought iron fence, and beyond it is the cemetery. And that was essentially, if you were condemned to death, that was your view, you know, while you were in the dungeon waiting, you know, for your day of execution. You would look through the bars and, you know, beyond it, the cemetery. But also to people who designed this space, they said to them the tombstones represented all the individuals in the community who stood by mute, even though they knew that something was going wrong, as we'll talk about in a minute, you know, but they were afraid to say anything because that was a sure guarantee of being the next one to be accused. And we'll show some examples of that or whatever. But, and then right here, I don't know if you can see, but there's this threshold. Into it are carved various protests of innocence taken right from the trial, or, you know, the documents. And you'll see the wall I'm standing on and the wall on the other end, what they've done is cut off right in the middle of a word or a sentence, one of those protestations. And that was symbolic of what happened when you got into the courtroom. You know, you'd be standing there trying to defend yourself, and the girls would explode into these incredible fits, and they would just drown you out, or the judges would just shut you off, you know, and when they wanted you, they got you, you know. And anyway, once nurse, you know, that this whole new shift of accusing people that you resent and hate starts developing, you know, the accusations start really flying. And by the end of May, there are over 100 people in prison awaiting trial. And here's how some of it happens. Abigail Hobbs, who many times over the years, you know, she was from Topsfield, many times over the years had said, I'm a witch, and she was kind of nuts. You know, nobody paid any attention to her, and to Abigail again. Well, in 1692, she says she's a witch, and everybody believes her, you know, and she implicates her mother, and by the time her mother's done, she's confessed too, and they've got 19 more witches in jail, you know, and it just keeps exploding and exploding. And by the end of May, the jails are full. They're hiring, or they're paying people to take accused witches and hold them in their own houses, like house arrest, you know, because there's no more room in the jail. And the governor, of course, is not far removed. He was thinking at this point, he wants this thing over. He disbands the court of Oyer and Terminer, and he writes to the King of England, says, I'm not doing anything until I hear back from you, you know. And while he's waiting to hear back, his own wife gets accused of witchcraft, and he loses all enthusiasm for pursuing it any further. The new court, according to the king, the new court to be set up, which convenes in January, it's the same people pretty much, but they're not allowed to use spectral evidence, and it's a superior court now. Up to this point, you were not allowed to have a defense attorney, and you were not allowed to appeal if you were found guilty. But under the new court, the superior court, you know, those two things were rectified. So hardly anybody is convicted, and, you know, those who were almost immediately pardoned by the governor. And in May of 1693, 14 months after the whole thing began, there's a general pardon and release, and everybody's allowed to go free after they paid their bill. Because when you were put in prison, it was like a tax generator for the colony. You know, they made you pay for room and board, court costs, and even rental of the chains they were keeping in. You know, and it's funny to an extent, except if you happen to be somebody like Tituba, the slave woman, you know, who had absolutely no money of her own. She was a slave, and Reverend Paris despised her for letting this thing break out in his house, and he let her rot in jail for 6 months until a gentleman from Virginia, unknown, you know, bought her rights as a slave and